Imagine waking up one morning to discover that a force from the most remote region on Earth had begun conquering the world at a speed no government could stop. Cities that stood for centuries were suddenly gone. Armies that had dominated entire regions were collapsing in a matter of days. Kings who once ruled comfortably behind fortress walls were abandoning their capitals and fleeing into exile. And the people responsible for this chaos did not come from powerful kingdoms or wealthy civilizations. They came from the Mongolian steppe, a harsh grassland where survival depended on horseback riding, hunting, and constant movement. In the early 1200s, these tribes were barely noticed by the powerful empires surrounding them. But within a single generation, they would build the largest land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of Europe. To understand the scale, imagine a single empire today controlling China, Russia, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and parts of Eastern Europe at the same time. That is roughly what the Mongols achieved. And the man who started it all began life as a starving child on the steppe. His name was Temujin. The world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. Temujin was not born into power. His early life looked more like the beginning of a survival story than the rise of a conqueror. When he was only 9 years old, his father, who had been a minor tribal leader, was poisoned by rivals. With their protector gone, the family was abandoned by their tribe and left to fend for themselves on the unforgiving Mongolian steppe. This was not the kind of environment where a struggling family could rely on neighbors for help. Winters were brutal, food was scarce, and rival tribes constantly competed for resources. Temujin's family survived by hunting small animals and gathering whatever they could find. At one point, Temujin was captured by another clan and forced into slavery. He wore a wooden collar around his neck to prevent escape and spent his days under constant watch. But he escaped, and when he returned to freedom, something about him had changed. Instead of accepting the rigid tribal hierarchy of steppe society, Temujin began building alliances in a completely new way. In most tribal systems, power belonged to noble families who inherited leadership through bloodlines. Temujin ignored that tradition. He rewarded loyalty and ability instead of birth. A shepherd could become a commander if he proved capable. A former enemy could become a trusted ally if he demonstrated loyalty. In modern terms, Temujin was creating something like a performance-based military organization, something far more flexible and effective than the aristocratic systems used by many medieval kingdoms. By the early 1200s, he had united the Mongol tribes under his command. The steppe had never seen unity on this scale before. Temujin was now called Genghis Khan, meaning something close to ruler of all. And the world beyond the steppe had no idea what was coming. Most medieval armies moved slowly. Infantry marched across muddy roads. Supply wagons crawled behind them, and entire campaigns could collapse simply because soldiers ran out of food. The Mongol army operated on a completely different system. Every warrior traveled with multiple horses. When one animal became tired, the rider simply switched to another. This allowed Mongol armies to move astonishing distances without stopping. While European armies might travel 30 kilometers in a day, Mongol forces could cover 100 kilometers or more. Imagine trying to defend a city when an enemy army could move 3 times faster than any messenger warning you about it. Their weapons were equally terrifying. The Mongols used a powerful composite bow made from wood, horn, and sinew. It was small enough to fire from horseback, but strong enough to pierce armor at remarkable distances. But their greatest advantage was coordination. Using signal flag, horns, and fast riders, Mongol commanders could maneuver thousands of warriors across huge battlefields. Entire units could split apart, surround an enemy, and reassemble in minutes. To medieval armies used rigid formations and slow movement, the Mongols felt less like an army and more like a swarm. The Mongols understood something many modern military strategists still study today. Fear can be just as powerful as weapons. When a city resisted Mongol rule, the consequences were often devastating. Entire populations could be wiped out, and survivors were deliberately allowed to escape so they could spread the story. News traveled quickly along trade routes. By the time the Mongol army approached the next city, its reputation had already arrived. Imagine hearing that every city that resisted had been destroyed, and that the same army was now marching toward your walls. Many rulers made a simple calculation. Surrender was safer than resistance. In this way, the Mongols used reputation as a strategic tool, conquering cities not only with arrows and cavalry, but with the psychological impact of their own legend. Once the Mongol war machine began moving, it seemed almost unstoppable. Northern China fell first after years of brutal campaigns against the Jin dynasty. Then the Mongols turned west. They swept across Central Asia, capturing wealthy cities that thrived along the Silk Road for centuries. Samarkand, Bokhara, and many others were absorbed into the expanding empire. In 1258, Mongol armies reached Baghdad, one of the most important cities in the Islamic world. The fall of Baghdad shocked the region and marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. Meanwhile, in Europe, Mongol armies defeated Polish and Hungarian forces in battles that left European rulers wondering if their entire continent might soon face invasion. At its greatest extent, the Mongol Empire stretched across roughly 24 million square kilometers. That territory connected East Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe under a single imperial system. No land empire before or since has controlled such a vast continuous region. Despite the devastation that accompanied Mongol conquest, something unexpected emerged once the expansion slowed. The same empire that had reduced entire cities to silence began to create a level of stability across Eurasia that had not existed for centuries. This period is often described by historians as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. The phrase does not imply kindness or gentleness. Mongol rule remained unforgiving toward rebellion. Entire regions could still be punished brutally if they threatened imperial authority. But for those who accepted Mongol rule and participated in the empire's economic system, daily life became remarkably predictable compared to the chaos that had existed before. Before the Mongols arrived, Eurasia was divided among dozens of competing states. Borders shifted constantly. Wars interrupted trade routes. Caravans traveling between China, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean faced bandits, hostile armies, and corrupt officials demanding bribes at every checkpoint. The Mongols changed this environment almost overnight. Instead of fragmented territories, vast stretches of land suddenly answered to a single imperial authority. From the Pacific coast of China to the markets of the Middle East, trade routes fell under Mongol protection. Their leadership understood something that many conquerors ignored. Wealth moved along the roads that linked civilizations. Destroying cities could win wars. Protecting trade could build empires. To manage this enormous network, the Mongols built a communication and transportation system that functioned with astonishing efficiency for the medieval world. Across the empire, relay stations known as yam posts were constructed at regular intervals along major routes. Each station maintained fresh horses, supplies, and lodging for official messengers. A rider carrying imperial orders could travel across thousands of kilometers by switching horses at each station, moving at a speed that rivaled some early modern postal systems. Messages that might have taken months under early regimes could now cross entire regions in a matter of days. To merchants, the Mongol Empire became something close to a medieval version of a continental trade corridor. Traders received official tablets called peza, small metal plaques that served as passports issued by the Mongol authorities. Possessing one meant local officials were required to provide protection, horses, and assistance along the journey. In practical terms, this transformed the experience of long-distance travel. A merchant could begin a journey in northern China, travel across Central Asia, pass through Persia, and eventually reach the eastern Mediterranean with fewer obstacles than had existed for generations. The political map had been replaced by a single, enormous sphere of influence. The impact on trade was immediate. Silk, spices, precious metals, and textiles move along the revived Silk Road in increasing quantities. Caravans carried Chinese porcelain westward, while Persian glassware and Middle Eastern fabrics traveled east. Entire cities prospered as commercial hubs within this expanding economic network. But the exchange was not limited to luxury goods. Ideas traveled with the caravans. Technologies that had developed in one part of the world slowly appeared in another. Paper money, already circulating in China, became known to merchants operating far beyond East Asia. Knowledge of gunpowder, originally developed in Chinese military experiments, began to spread westward through trade and diplomatic contact. Agricultural techniques, engineering knowledge, and medical ideas crossed cultural boundaries that had previously limited their movement. Even religion and philosophy traveled these roads. Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian missionaries, and merchants from multiple cultures found themselves sharing the same caravan routes under Mongol supervision. The empire did not erase cultural differences, but forced civilizations into contact with each other at a scale that had rarely occurred before. Among the travelers who crossed this interconnected world was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant whose family journeyed deep into the Mongol Empire during the late 13th century. When he later described his travels to audiences in Europe, his story sounded almost unbelievable. He spoke of enormous cities in China whose populations dwarfed anything Europeans had seen. He described roads guarded by imperial officials, markets overflowing with goods from distant lands, and relay stations that allowed messages to move across entire regions with astonishing speed. To European listeners, these accounts painted a picture of a world that seemed impossibly vast and strangely organized under Mongol rule. An empire built by riders from the steppe had become the central bridge between civilizations. The irony was impossible to ignore. The Mongols had entered history as conquerors who terrified entire regions with their military campaigns. Yet once their empire stabilized, they created conditions that allowed goods, knowledge, and people to travel farther and faster than they had for centuries. The same force that had shattered kingdoms also reshaped the connections between them. In doing so, the Mongols did more than conquer Eurasia. They stitched it together. But empires built through relentless conquest carry a hidden weakness. They expand faster than they can stabilize. During the lifetime of Genghis Khan, unity was maintained through sheer force of personality and absolute loyalty. His authority was unquestioned, and the generals who rode under his banner obeyed a single command structure that stretched from the Mongolian steppe to the walls of distant cities. Once that central figure disappeared, the reality of ruling such a massive empire began to reveal itself. Genghis Khan had divided his territories among his sons and grandsons, assuming that shared blood and shared victory would preserve unity. In practice, it created something closer to a family-controlled superpower with competing branches of leadership. Each region of the empire faced different challenges, different cultures, and different political pressures. In China, Mongol rulers established the Yuan dynasty, attempting to govern one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic societies on Earth. The Mongol elite ruled from the top, but they had to manage millions of subjects accustomed to centuries of imperial administration. Further west, in Persia and the Middle East, another branch of the Mongol ruling family created the Ilkhanate, a state that controlled wealthy cities, ancient trade routes, and populations shaped by Persian and Islamic traditions. To the north, across the vast plains of Russia and Eastern Europe, the Golden Horde emerged as a dominant power. Its leaders controlled enormous territories, extracting tribute from Russian principalities and influencing the political development of Eastern Europe for generations. At first, these regions still acknowledged a shared Mongol heritage. They recognized the legacy of Genghis Khan and the idea of a greater empire. But distance has a way of reshaping power. The Mongol Empire stretched across thousands of kilometers, an expanse so large that communication alone could take months. Local rulers began adapting their governments to the realities around them. In China, Mongol rulers gradually absorbed elements of Chinese administration. In Persia, Mongol elites adopted aspects of Persian culture and eventually converted to Islam. In the Western territories, Mongol rulers became deeply entangled in the politics of Eastern Europe and the Russian principalities. The empire that had once moved like a single unstoppable force began to fragment into distinct political worlds. Rivalries emerged. Diplomacy replaced unified command. The descendants of Genghis Khan still ruled vast territories, but they no longer operated as a single empire. By the late 1300s, the unified Mongol Empire had effectively dissolved. What remained were powerful states shaped by Mongol origins, but guided by local priorities. Yet the consequences of their rise could not simply fade away. The Mongols had shattered ancient kingdoms, redirected trade routes, and forced civilizations from China to Europe to rethink warfare, diplomacy, and survival. Borders shifted, dynasties fell, entire regions reorganized their political systems in response to the shock of Mongol expansion. In the span of a few generations, a coalition of steppe riders had redrawn the map of Eurasia. And even after the empire itself fractured, the world it created continued to shape global history for centuries. The Mongols began as scattered tribes living in felt tents on the wind-swept grasslands of Central Asia. Within one lifetime, they built the largest land empire the world has ever seen. Their rise proved something history demonstrates again and again. Power does not always emerge in the richest cities or the most advanced civilizations. Sometimes it comes from the places the world ignores. And when it does, it can change the course of history. If you want to see how another empire reshaped the world, subscribe. The next story might be even more shocking.